All right, I say we start. Just a reminder, the screen is not important, but if you like that visual addition, I do work off of it. So it is something that you can always look at instead of reading a long text, or just because we're bored. On that note, just to jump right into the questions, but one of the things that's very interesting about this first question is there's something that I realized, and it's part of this class's theme to a degree. We take things that are Jewish for granted. We just assume or we follow the flow. And of course, this theme, the theme of this discussion for sure last week, and in general in Judaism, is that we should participate in the thought process, try to understand something, and of course, understand that sometimes we won't understand it fully or partially. The symbol of the Jewish star, or the Star of David, also known as the Magen David, which means the shield of David, is one of those interesting things that really has no specific text or specific source. So what we're going to use today are sources that give ideas, but there is no one definitive source that says this is where the shield or this is where the Star of David comes from. And so I always think about that when people ask me this question, because it's actually quite a common question of the Star of David. And so just keep that in mind. What we're reading now from the text that we'll read are, of course, Jewish sourced, but there's no one answer to this question. And that's what I really love about it. So we're going to do like last time. We'll start with whoever's reading, if they can share their name and where they're from. And so we're just picking up with you.
Okay.
We're going to start on the left side.
Joe from Newark, New Jersey, but I've been here for about 49 years.
Wow, so Newark. Okay, so we're again page 48. It's lesson number 2, and we can pick right up.
Okay. It is well known that the Star of David has been used on ark curtains and Torah covers for centuries without any controversy. Though we do not know the origins of the Star of David, this alone does not constitute an objection to its use. In fact, one can find important symbolism in the Star of David in that it serves to remind us that God reigns over what is above and below and over the 4 directions. Perhaps the connection with David is that when he went to war, he placed his trust in God's all-encompassing reign, and therefore, in accordance with the Torah's instruction to not be afraid while in battle, he was not intimidated by human armies and kings.
So one of the things, at least the way when I read this question, or I should say answer, because if you look, it's responsa by Igrot Moshe. This is one of the most well-known of recent, he has passed, but of recent like rabbis who answer questions on Jewish law, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And so it almost seems like somebody is asking him, can we put this Star of David on our Jewish curtains, of the curtains in the ark? Because maybe it has nothing to do with Judaism. Like, where did this symbol come from? And we're facing it when we pray, and is it allowed? So his first thing that he writes is like, hey, it's generations that it's been there, so you can just take a deep breath. But now, like, what's one of the ideas that maybe it represents is there are 6 points on this. There are 4 corners of the world, and then there is up and down. And so this was what King David used when he went to war, showing that God is everywhere, God's reign is everywhere, and therefore, if I put my trust in God, I'm going to win. That was what he posits, right? He gives us as a thought. Maybe this is what it is. But as you know, today we're going to read a couple of these ideas, and so we're going to jump into text number 2, of course.
My reading, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Star of David really didn't become a Jewish symbol until the Middle Ages. It's always been the menorah. And you just
I think that is correct, and that's part of this question. It's like, where did this start, and how did it start, and was it really David's? That's kind of part of the question. When did it start, and did David ever use it? Well, we're saying it's David's, so clearly we're saying it goes. If you call it the Star of David, there's an idea that means David used this, which is going back thousands of years. Maybe they didn't know it was David from like East Side, you know. But yeah, the idea is there's so many different opinions. You are correct. It's like, wait, is this, where is it from? Did David even have it? And the truth is just not that this is a spoiler alert, but the last text that we're going to read is going to talk about the menorah instead of the star. So yes. So thank you. So text number 2 is what we'll.
Hi, I'm Suzanne, and I've been in Arizona for 9 years, originally from Ohio. Good to be here. The Talmud recounts Shabbat 88a, how a certain Galilean lectured, "Blessed is God, who gave the three-dimensional Torah to a three-dimensioned people." Three-dimensioned Torah refers to the Bible, which consists of the Pentateuch, prophets, and writings, or that the Torah comprises the written Torah, oral Torah, and Kabbalah. Three-dimensioned people refers to the fact that the Jews consist of priests, Levites, and Israelites. The Star of David, which consists of 2 interlaced triangles, each with 3 points, alludes to these tripartite entities. There were kings of Israel who fought valiantly on behalf of the Jewish people, but only for the people and not the Torah. In fact, many of them were wayward and neglected the Torah. But the Jews without the Torah are like a body without a soul. Without the Torah, we cannot be a people. The bond between the Jewish people and the Torah ought never to be severed. This bond will establish a vigorous Jewish continuity. Indeed, David, the pious and righteous king, fought his wars to protect both the Jewish people and the Torah. He thus linked the Torah of 3 with the people of 3. This is the message conveyed by the Star of David.
So again, he's quoting this verse, "Blessed is God who gave the 3-dimension Torah to a 3-dimension people." So we have 2 triangles, they mesh together and become the Star of David. And this is what King David and that's why he uses this as in context. He's like, there have been Jewish kings who have fought wars for the Jewish people, but they didn't connect the Jewish people with God. They fought for the body, not for the soul. And so the Star of David represented this idea that King David was always thinking about God and God's people, the Jewish people. And so he defended the Torah and the Jewish nation. And so here you have 2 answers so far. One being that King David thought about God's presence in this world, and that's what he took with him to war. And the second one is that this is what he fought for. He fought for the Jewish people and for God, and we're both defined by 3. And now we go to another answer, which I'm going to share with a little bit of I'm going to use the diagram, but you can also use the figure on page 51. So I know I touched this last week slightly, and I didn't really explain it, but in Judaism, we talk about something called the sphirot. This is more of a Kabbalistic idea, and that is that the way God expresses himself comes through different, I'm going to say tunnels, through different expressions. So you can express yourself through kindness, through discipline, strength, beauty. Each of these are different ways that God gives in this world. Now, the thing is that there's really a 7th. And the 7th sphira, the 7th of these sphirot is malchut, which is kingship. And so kingship is kind of like the verbal communications. When I talk, I'm not creating anything. I'm just sharing an expression that came through my mind. And so the idea of this 7th sphira, the 7th attribute, is that it takes of these 6 and shares them. And so when we talk about King David, and this is where we're coming to, so sphira as a communication, those are the mediums, the ways that, so for example, one of the examples that's always given is if I have a stained glass window, it's one light, God, for example, or the sun in the sense of the stained glass, and it comes through different colors of glass, so it expresses differently, but the light didn't change. And so when we talk about sphirot, it's important to remind ourselves, God doesn't change when he gives through kindness or through strength, but these are the channels. And so when we look at something, we say, oh, that was a strong God, that was a weak person, whatever it is. Those are the expressions, but the person or God in that instance doesn't change. And so malchut is the way that King David, who was that sphira or who identified and was the recipient of these 6 channels and brought them into this world. That's the idea. So the 6 of the star are the 6 sephirot, but King David was the one who, as the king and who fit into that 7th, I'm going to say process them into this world. And so if we would like to read that, that's text number 3.
I'm Rita, I'm from Chicago, and I've been here 30 years. The kings of Israel and the kings of Judah who descended from David carried differently shaped shields. The kings of Israel had triangular shields. The kings of Judah carried 6-pointed shields to show that they were rooted in the 7th divine attribute of the Malchut, sovereignty, and were nourished by the 6 preceding attributes.
So again, just symbolic. But like we mentioned, which answer is correct? I'm going to leave the question without an answer on that. Okay, now to come back to what we shared earlier. Was King David's shield truly a 6-pointed star, or maybe it was something else? And so that's what we're going to do with text number 4 in just a moment. This is the ironic twist that was brought up. There is a text that says that his shield actually had a menorah on it, which we'll read about in a second. But the menorah itself had a symbol. It was a symbol. The menorah, it said, had 3 legs, the way it was built, and it stood on 3 legs, not a 4-leg menorah, not a flat menorah. Each of those legs represented something. 3 fundamental principles. What were they? Number 1, that God exists. Number 2, that God communicated to humanity and to the world. And number 3, that we have free choice, because if you don't believe we have free choice, then we're robots, and there's no purpose in creation if we just do a function that God programmed us to do. So these are 3 fundamental principles that we believe in as Jews, and that the menorah itself represented. And so the menorah was symbolic of these 3 things. So there is an author of the Code of Jewish Law. His name was Rabbi Moshe Isserles. He was the Ashkenaz author, because there was a Sephardic one first. And so he discusses this idea about the menorah, and then he concludes with text number 4, which we will have, I guess, Charlotte, we're not going to skip you. You read last time, right? But we'll do it anyways.
I'm Charlotte, I'm from Milwaukee, I've been here almost 50 years. We hold a tradition that a menorah adorned David's shield because the merit of David's study of Torah and his adherence to our beliefs and foundations of faith protected him in battle. The menorah was his shield and armor. Do you want me to read
The key points?
Yeah.
No, we can, those are always good to read afterwards on our own. But to just summarize for a second, so the 3 principles were God exists, God told us and communicated to us the Torah, which tells us what is right, what is wrong, how to live our lives. And then number 3, that we have the free choice to do that, which means there's reward, punishment, and it goes according to how we conduct ourselves. After he finished that, he said, hey, by the way, the menorah was his shield. This idea that God communicated to this world these principles to do the right thing, that was his source of spiritual strength. And that gave him physical success. So again, multiple answers, but none are right or wrong. You don't like that, right?
When you look at something like you're talking about the base of normal 3, 3
3 legs, yeah.
legs. Is the belief that that's why it was created that way? Or are these all nice interpretations to give us something to hold on to give us positive ideas, looking at things that were used and exist and giving them symbolism?
All right, so I like that question. Did everyone catch that? It was a very good question. Right? Are we coming after the fact and giving an explanation to it, or is this why God said so? I think the correct answer, at least the way I would share it, is it exists. The Ramah wrote an entire book. That was how he was called. Rabbi Moshe Isserles wrote an entire book all about the temple and everything that was inside of it. And so he gave additional meaning, is how I would look at that. Right? Because in the end of the day, the menorah represented one thing, which was that God's presence rests in the temple. That is from the Torah. Now, once you know that God's presence rested, let's talk about the menorah and see how we can find that within the menorah's shape, decorations, size. And so he said, okay, let's talk about the legs. That's a foundation. What is the foundation of this idea that God represents and that God's presence rests in the temple? Okay, so number one is that there's an existence of God. I think it's an after the fact, but it's connected to the main theme of the menorah. That's kind of how it's not like, oh, let's just grab an idea and say this is what it means. The menorah represented that in a general sense, and he just puts it into more particular ideas. So that's the answer is yes and yes. That's how I would look at that. It is an after the fact, but it's connected to the main theme. How's that? Okay. Today's questions that are asked, if you asked me as a rabbi, nothing to do with this class, what are some of the more difficult questions? My answer would be the ones that are emotional, meaning the ones that people ask me because they don't like something. And so mikveh is one of those things that when people ask us because they don't like the idea, there's something that doesn't sit well with them. They don't like this idea that you have to go into a body of water to clean yourself. And so I want to give it the right appropriate time. If you have questions after we read this, definitely ask. Some of it might not be for this discussion, but it's important to me that you understand that I understand these questions too. Like I understand why somebody is bothered by something. Is it because they're correct or our assumptions are correct? Probably not. But I know how our society talks about things. I know how people talk about things. And so the mikveh is one of those ideas that people either don't get or don't like. And so what is the mikveh before we go into the question? Before we go into the question, why does it purify? So in Judaism, traditionally, there were a number of things that could make a person ritually impure, which was very important in temple times. Because if you want to go on the Temple Mount, you had to go to the mikveh first. In fact, if you go to the southern wall, so we all visit the western wall, the southern wall is a museum. There are a number of mikvahs that they found when they were digging archaeologically. Now, why are there so many mikvahs right there? Because if you were coming to the temple, you had to make sure you were ritually pure. Now, what does ritually pure have anything to do with Judaism? I just want to put that out there. God said so. All right, ritual purity and impurity is one of the laws that we don't have a reason for. But we're going to try, as we mentioned, to the best of our intellectual ability, try to come up with an understanding of it, also knowing that God didn't give us a reason. In fact, this question is one of the reasons why Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed was burned at the stake, because he gave reasons, and people were very upset about that. And I'll share how and why in a moment. So Jewish law says, where is a mikveh today used? Two things I think that most people will see. Number one is conversion. You're converting, you go into the mikveh. But number two, and this is where it is the most difficult for, I would say, our society, our generation, that is the mikveh purifies, but who uses it? Women. And when do they use it? Specifically after a period, married women specifically. And so it goes through a lot of, I'm going to say, first of all, misunderstanding. There's a lot of dislike to it. The idea that a woman can be, because she's going through her cycle, she's not pure and not clean. I think the word people use is clean, and that bothers them. And so what we're going to try to do is just understand it a bit more. So again, those are the two times that a mikveh is used in the modern day. People can still go to the mikveh regardless of those two reasons. Like before Yom Kippur, what I have found is that many women who are not in the traditional sense using a mikveh will go the night before. Men will do it on the day of. And so the mikveh is still a thing that kind of puts a person into a different perspective. And that's what we're going to talk about now. Like why mikveh? Why does a mikveh purify? I am using the screen for just a moment. I turned the volume off of this video. What I want to do is just show you something. In modern Israel today, they talk about the mikveh a lot because for two reasons. Number one is every time they do an archaeological dig and they find a mikveh, they get excited because people have always questioned, has Judaism changed? Do we have a new Judaism that the rabbis imposed on us and, just to make our lives difficult? Or is it the same as before? And so, for example, when they discovered Masada, they found a mikveh. Who was excited? The rabbis, because that dates back to the Second Temple. If it dates back to the Second Temple and there's a mikveh, let's go and check if the mikveh fulfills the same kind of requirements of size of body of water that we use today. And it did. They came with measuring sticks. The rabbis went up the mountain. This is before they had the lift. You can only climb it. So I want to use this video for just a moment so you can see what they look like when we talk about older mikvahs of stone. This is Masada as they discovered it, but he's talking about the discovery. Well, while we're looking at it, I will share something interesting. When I did the Southern Wall tour, they had an audio, you could listen to, you put the number and you could listen to it. They talked about the mikvah had like a separation on the stairs. So and the way they explained it was you go down on one side, which meant you went into the water impure, you came out on the other side pure, ritually, but you didn't want to touch somebody going down because then they would impurify you, right? So they had this little like steps with a separator in the middle so that, now this is Masada, as you can see if you've been. And just a moment, I will skip it afterwards once it gets to the mikveh itself so you can see what they're talking about. It's a longer video and I want to make sure that we work on time well. So if you've never seen an aerial view, now you know why this was a fortress. Let's put some audio in the meantime. Shall
Reached the summit. They found the fortress eerily empty. Men, women, and children had chosen to end their lives rather than fall into Roman hands. Among the artifacts, Yedaya discovered one of Israel's most ancient synagogues, built to face Jerusalem, as well as to fill fragments of the Torah, Psalms, and Ezekiel's prophecy of the resurrection. Most surprisingly, Yadin uncovered a carefully constructed kosher mikveh for ritual immersion. Masada's open-air mikveh was remarkably well built, with a series of broad plastered stairs leading into the depth of a pool fed by rainwater. A spacious dressing area surrounds the mikveh. The site is protected by thick stone walls set with large cavities to serve as cubbies to hold clothing and personal items. For convenience, the mikveh was located in proximity to the rebels' dwellings along the southern edge. Jews have been building mikvahs ever since Sinai, under every condition and in the most unlikely places. But this was a first. Hundreds of feet in the air under a blazing Judean sun, with sand stretching for miles below in a rocky desert, and where water is scarce. Moreover, this mikveh was built by besieged rebels, holding out against the might of Rome, when the entire land had fallen in flames, and the second temple in Jerusalem had been razed to the...
All right, I'm gonna skip that. I just want you to see, when we talk about the mikveh, it's not some new concept or new agey thing. But again, the question is, why does it purify? Like, why is this the item that makes a purification process happen? And then, of course, why is purification needed? Do you have a question on that? Yeah, that's fine. It's muted. So the first thing is that, and like I mentioned, most of us associate water as a cleaning agent. We go into a shower, a bath, and so we use it to clean dirt. And that's really the first problem with our association with the mikveh, is like we think it means a woman or a man in that situation, but a woman primarily nowadays is dirty. And that's the first problem. And so the first thing that Maimonides does, and we'll read text 5 in just a moment, keep it like that, is tell us that a mikveh has nothing to do with dirt, has nothing to do with cleanliness. What does it have to do? So, we'll get to Leonard.
I'm Benny Weber, originally from Milwaukee, and been here 4 years. Immersing in the mikveh to emerge from a state of impurity is an ordinance with rationale exceeds human understanding. It has nothing to do with filth that can be washed away by water. It is a divine utility.
So in keeping with the theme of our discussion, number one, God said so. But number two, and this is what is important to us and for our discussion today, maybe there's some understanding that we can try to understand, because that's really what we're trying to do. Even though God said so and didn't give a reason that supersedes any human comprehension, maybe there's more to it. And so the sages have talked about it, and that's what we're going to use in just a moment. So here are two different texts that give two different ideas of why this body of water purifies. And of course, we are very much dumbing it down. It's not just any body of water. It is collected in a specific way. It's rainwater or snow melts. You can't, there are a lot of rules to what makes something a kosher mikveh, but a person could go into the ocean. It's not the recommended because you want to make sure you're fully submersed and you might be afraid and other reasons. A river that's not from rainwater, I'm sorry, that's not just from, some rivers will work. So there are different ways that you can do this without building a mikveh. It's only a more modern thing that we build mikvahs with heated water. They look like spas. They're really beautiful now. Why? Because it's a mitzvah. Why shouldn't we make it something that's beautiful and celebrate it? But again, let's try to understand why a mikveh purifies. So text number 6a. Dennis, if you'd like.
Dennis from Boston, Massachusetts, and I've been here 30 years. We enter the mikveh to return our spirituality, wondrous bodies and souls to their origins. In the mikveh we are enveloped like a fetus in the womb of its mother. When we emerge from the mikveh, our bodies and souls are restored. We become like new and negative forces have no part of us. We should sense a new spirit from the sparkle of the soul that has been returned to us. Before entering the mikveh, it is appropriate to repent of the wrongdoings.
So his first answer, or the first answer that we're reading, which is from Maimonides, from Rabbi Eliyahu Davidas, says that a mikveh is like being born. You were in your mother's fetus, you were surrounded by water, amniotic fluid, right? I'm not a doctor, but I think that's the correct term. I'm joking. And so when you enter the mikveh, you are feeling like being born. And so that's number one. But he says, hey, when you do go in, try to think about repentance, starting anew. The second answer, text 6b. So Janet.
So before, Janet's originally from, and been here since 19. Before I read, can I, that's enough.
Is it going to digress?
It's about mikvahs.
Let's do it at the end.
Okay.
Hold your thought, though. Do you need a pen to write it down?
No, it's my,
Okay. So I want you to share it, but we'll do it right at the end of this question.
so after immersion, as if we were created anew at that moment. But with immersion, we return to the primordial state when existence was enveloped by, as it says, Genesis 1:2, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. We must contemplate that just as our bodies have undergone renewal, so too our behavior should be renewed for the better.
Okay, so the word that we want to use is renewal. Both of them, both ideas are sharing this idea of renewal. One uses the idea of a child, a baby being born, and the other one talks about the world. In creation, if you follow the 6 days of creation, I know there are 7, but 6 of God's actions, you find that the world was full of water, and then God separates the waters from the heavens and the earth. And so the world in its original, the way it was at its very beginning, was full of water. And so the idea of going into a mikveh is to put yourself in that mindset and think of renewal. Think about the change that you want from yourself before immersing, which is why he said, in the first one, he said, appropriate to repent. In the second one, he says we ought to contemplate that just as our bodies have undergone renewal, so too our behavior should be renewed. So the idea is to put us into this mindset. Just a quick digression. Why was Maimonides' book burned at the stake by Jews who said, hey, that's heresy? Was because they were afraid that his book, which had these types of explanations, would make you say, you know what, I don't need to go into the water. I can do that through meditation. And so they were afraid of that. So they didn't like his book to begin with. And so then they found issues. So I think it's important to remember that the goal in the end of the day is the water. But why? Because God said so. But if I can put myself in a mindset while I'm in the water that gives me some purpose and some idea and some intent and some meditation, the idea is rebirth or new in the sense of renewal, whether you use the child or you use the world as your idea. So this is kind of two ways to look at the mikveh as rebirth, an opportunity to change, an opportunity to start again. So again, the two things were renewal through repentance or renewal by just saying, I'm going to be a better person. Now, there is another idea that we kind of touched last week, and I'm going to apply it to this idea. And that is when we talk about, again, in more of the mystical texts, they talk about sea and land. And we shared that the sea, any creature or living organism in the sea is fully, I'm going to say fully engulfed by its life source, by the water. And usually if they go out of the water, they can't survive. Whereas when we're on dry land, those animals that live on the dry land don't have that same feeling. They don't feel connected to their source. As when we talk about a sea life conscious or a sea consciousness in Judaism, what we're saying is you always feel God at every moment because you're kind of under the water, the way our life is connected to us as a sea creature. But when we're on land, we don't feel God. We feel separate from God. And so we're going to read another text, text 7a, which is saying that the idea of the mikveh is this sea consciousness. And so, Leslie, you're up.
I'm Leslie Leafy from Brooklyn, New York, and I've been here 25 years. In the beginning, water encompassed all of existence. What is now dry land was subsumed in the sea until God spoke. Let the waters gather, etc., and let the dry land appear. Genesis 1:9. Similarly, in a spiritual sense, what was to become an independent existence was initially part of the submerged.
So when God pulls back the waters in creation, the land was an illusion of independence. Like, oh, now God's not my source. I can make that mistake. I don't need God. I'm separate from my life source. Or I don't even notice God. But the mikveh represents the sea consciousness. And so again, if you want to use that screen, the land, we feel separate from God. Sea, we are fully submerged by our life source. And so we feel that connection. And so the goal of the mikveh is to tap into that mindset. So not using the idea of renewal, but realizing that our entire life is dependent on God, that we want to connect to that God and to that idea. So text 7b, Brad.
When human beings dwell in a world that seems independent from God, immersing on mikveh, it represents a huge state of existence. They return to their original source, in which change can flow.
So again, so we had two answers that we've shared. One was the mikveh as an idea of renewal, and the second one is that we want to be surrounded and full with godliness in our lives. So those are the two answers that we shared. Why does a mikveh purify? You want to add something, Janet, or you want to wait till the next mikveh question?
Well, yes, well, so, like, just about 50 years ago, my husband and I adopted my first son. And we were not affiliated with any synagogues or anything like that, so we just went to the elevators and, being, living in Queens at the time. And just picked a rabbi, to say, we were bringing him home. He was a 1 week old from Washington, D.C. And, we just wanted, and he was, circumcised by a Jewish, rabbi. And so we wanted to have some kind of baby name, like that. So he said, was he born of Jewish mother? And I was honest, I said, I don't know, I think not, And so he says, well, we have to convert him. So my husband had, convert him. I said, he can't really talk yet. And so it didn't sit well. It did not sit well, particularly with my own husband. And, so nothing was ever really explained, so then, went back and found a rabbi that suited our needs and, did baby. It's disturbing to me that, my husband was born Jewish, I was born Jewish, we're trying to raise our children in a Jewish home. And, why do I have to take this baby and
Convert them.
and dip them into the mikveh and breakfast and say, okay, now you're Jewish.
Okay, so not to cut you off, we are going to discuss that in this class.
Oh, we are.
We are.
Okay, good.
But before we're not touching that yet. We do talk about what makes someone Jewish, meaning like matrilineal, patrilineal descent, and it will touch that point just a bit. But I will tell you, just so everyone here knows, if a child is converted, they have to be asked as an adult if they want to remain Jewish. And so I was telling this to somebody a couple weeks ago. She's like, I don't think my granddaughter was asked. I said, well, is she going to change her mind if you ask her? But that's yes.
My sister, my niece was adopted and my sister and brother-in-law went to the exact same thing and also was very, very uncomfortable. So you're not alone in.
But by the way, I feel like the theme is not even the answer to the why. It's that no one spoke to you about the why. They said, this is what we do. Because like if they would have said, okay, if you don't want to do it now, let's revisit it at 7, at 9, whatever, you would have had a different reaction. But they said, this is what we do.
And a year and a half later, I gave birth.
Right. You want-
I gave birth to a healthy boy. And, I did not do the traditional breast I love.
All right, well, I don't want to digress over here, but we'll get that. We'll get to that. 7:30 is when you can share all that. Yes, question. Sure.
Has it always been warm waters and feel like you're in the moon?
Okay, great question. You could totally do a cold plunge. When the mikveh filter, to answer your question, when the mikveh heater is broken, they're using cold water. Now, the goal is there's no rules about the water. There is rules about how much water needs to be in the basin. So just to use an idea of a modern mikveh idea is that there's going to be one collecting, the Hebrew is bor, one pit that collects the rainwater, and that kisses kind of by using, let's say it's on the side or underneath it, will depend how they use it, but they'll have a lid or a cover, and then they'll connect the larger spa part to that rainwater. So it's not all in one. It could be, but traditionally because of filtration and things like that, what they'll do is they'll have the rainwater collected in one area and then the larger spa. And that's filtered, it's clean. You want to know that you're going to something it's not going to make you sick. Let's put it that way. Okay, so now the question is, we understand what a mikveh does, but why do people need purification? That's the question. And so, again, the short answer is God said so. But we want to understand. We want to try to understand why is it that God said people can become impure. So for a convert, we understand it has nothing to do with like an impurity. It's more about our new beginning and a start. But why would a woman, for example, need the mikveh? And so there is a rabbi, his name is the Kutzker Rebbe, and that's the text we're going to read in just a moment. He addresses a similar question. He asks the question that why is it that a woman gives birth and she is considered impure? So she's not even talking about the cycle of the period, but rather like what his question was about birth. And so we're going to touch that and try to understand it the same way. So text number 8. Where are we up to? Rick, did you just read? Okay.
Rick from Boston, 25 years. When a woman who gives birth becomes panei, her children impure, can be explained for the Talmudic statement, 2a, that there are 3 keys that were made in God's hand and are not delegated to messengers, one of them being the key to childbirth. As it says, Genesis 30:22, and God remembered Rachel, he hearkened to her and opened her womb, teaching us that God himself is intimately present Follows clear form. That a level of holiness is present at the time of birth. Once a baby is born, this holiness departs from the mother, and tuma ensues. When there is a void of holiness, there can be tuma. Indeed, this is why the corpse is tamei.
So he shares that in childbirth, God has to be involved. I mean, we all know this. There are plenty of people who don't understand why they're not having a child. There's a God part to this that science hasn't figured out. And so because childbirth is a sacred process, when holiness departs, so he says tuma, which means impurity, the opposite of holiness, can result. And the idea behind that, not to go into the nitty-gritty because I don't know it, it's just that God, when there is an emptiness of holiness, there is an opportunity for the klipot, for those impurities to now attach themselves. And so because of that, when life ends, for example, when the soul departs from the body, that opportunity for impurity, for tuma, can result. So a person doesn't go to the mikveh when he transgresses, when he makes a mistake and sins. For that, we have teshuvah. A person would go to the mikveh when God causes a state of impurity, of tuma. That's the Hebrew word for it. But God also gives the opportunity of how to bring purification, and that is the mikveh. Now, this idea was specifically about childbirth. How does that connect to the menstrual cycle? And so one of the ways that more modern rabbis who kind of attach this idea is they're saying every single month there's an opportunity for birth. And so when the body releases that opportunity, the same concept exists, that there is an opportunity for something that is impure to cleave itself. But again, the mikvah would be the item or the method that affects spiritual, the opportunity for spirituality to be purified. So again, think about it as a spiritual loss, spiritual renewal. Now, I always think about these questions because, like I said, these are the tough questions. If you asked me this question in one of my discussions, there's a reason why you asked it. It might be because you truly want to learn, but usually it's something that bothers you. And so I do understand that part. And so the goal is, let's try to understand it best. Does that mean you like it or not? I mean, some of the things we do are because we're Jewish and that's what God gave us. And we want to be able to connect in a more meaningful way. And so that's really how I look at these questions, because I can tell you that I know very observant religious women who have the same struggle of this conversation. So it's not something to say, well, I never grew up with it. It sounds all hunky-dory, blah, blah, blah. But rather that it's a difficult idea that you're told, wait, that's something that is not good or it's not holy. So that's just some, I call it perspective and understanding when you look at these types of questions. Now, if this class would ignore these types of questions, that would be a blasé class too. So we want these types of questions, even if they make us think and question. That's how I look at it. I'm talking to myself, by the way. Yes.
Many men use the
Correct.
men also talk.
Correct. So, but that connects back to, okay, so just to share what Andrea said, there are men who use the mikveh. Some people use it on Shabbat. Some people use it on holidays. And then as well, a person, after they pass away, they go through a tahara, which is a purification process, which is for the body because the soul has left it. And so we purify the body. Who does that? In the traditional Jewish mortuaries, you have a group known as the Chevra Kadisha. If you've ever heard of that, that means the Holy Society. And they wash the body, preparing it for burial, and also a purification process. They are not dunked into a mikveh, though. They do it a little bit differently. But that is the same idea. There has been a void of holiness. The soul has left it. And so we do that. All right, now, next question. Continuing on this theme of questions. Why are there so many do's and don'ts in Judaism? And I come back to this thing that I just shared. Like, who asks a question like that? For laws of morality, we understand it. For how to treat others and all of those laws that we get. The laws that are about the spiritual, like how to pray, we get it. Even if we don't understand them all. but we understand why there are these laws. So I would guess that somebody who asked this question, whether it's ourselves or somebody else, they don't like the invasiveness of the laws. There are so many laws that they come home. If you are familiar with Code of Jewish Law, it tells you how to tie your shoe, which foot to start with, right or left. It tells you how to get dressed. That's where we, I think, start questioning. It's like, wait, does God really care if I put my right foot or my left foot into the shoe first? And so that's when people start asking these questions, like, okay, I can understand some of them, but like, why these? And so does God care about it? And if he doesn't, why should we? And if he does, why does he? So we're going to actually share a number of answers. We're going to read these texts together, but while we're reading it, if you wanted to read ahead or on your own, that's totally fine. We're going to read 3 different ideas of why we have so many mitzvot and so many mitzvot that really are a part of everyday life. Not just the big ones that we all understand, but the ones that are really governing how we eat, what we do in the bedroom, how we work, what we do on weekends, right? I mean, I can go on and on. I think we can all go on and on. So we're going to give 3 different understandings to this. So we'll start with text number 9a.
We probably walk from here, so she.
Another Milwaukee.
Another Milwaukee. The mitzvot were solely given to refined human beings. The mitzvot are not to benefit God. Their purpose is to benefit humankind and to keep them safe from harm. Shield them from the fruits of grace, terrible remind them of the miracles and wonders of the Creator, help them know God. The Midrash says that mitzvot are intended to refine human beings, as we would refer to refining silver. The act of refining silver is not senseless, it removes all impurities. So too, the mitzvot remove from our hearts every harmful belief, informs us of the truth, and enables us to keep it continuously in our mind.
We're gonna we'll analyze them afterwards. So go right to text 9b.
Lori Herman also from Milwaukee, favorite place of the day. This is the meaning of the blessed oversight before we fulfill the mitzvah. Blessed are you who has sanctified us with this weekend. The Hebrew word kiddushan, generally rendered as sanctified us, can also translate as betrothed us. Thus, the blessing implies that God betrothed us through giving us his soul. Just as a man betroths a woman in order to unite with her in a perfect bond, as it is written in Genesis, he shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Similarly, and infinitely more so, is our union with the infinite light of God when we engage in Torah and in souls. This is why King Solomon in Song of Songs depicts our union with God by means of a metaphor of a human bride, whose relationship is characterized by attachment, longing, desire, embracing, and embracing.
All right, and Valerie.
I'm Valerie and I'm from Chicago, and this is our 6th winter here. It is a well-known rabbinic statement that the purpose of the creation of this world, that God desired that the lowest world become for his presence. The culminating fulfillment of this depends on our actions and service throughout the creation of our exile. The reward of a commandment itself, meaning by virtue of performing the mitzvah, a person suffices the definite divine energy from above downward to be clothed in the corporeality of the Torah.
So if we were to kind of, before we just delve slightly more into it, if we were to kind of categorize each one of these opinions, number 1 was it refines the person who does the mitzvah. That's why he used the analogy of silver. Number 2 was it was a way to intimately connect us with God. And number 3 was to make a home for God in the physical world. These are the three ideas that you found in each of these texts. Three different perspectives of why we do the mitzvot and why there are so many mitzvot and why some of them really touch aspects of our lives that we're like, why does God want to get involved there? And so the first one was human refinement. Every mitzvah gives meaning to our lives. Who best would know how to make our lives more meaningful? Like, we can have many ideas. I can decide that this is the best way to live. You can decide that's the best way to live. But really, only God knows how we can realize that potential. And so, by doing mitzvot, even in the most mundane parts of our lives, the parts that you wouldn't consider spiritual, like, yeah, God even in the workplace, God even in the bedroom, God even in the way you dress, it changes us. It brings a more refinement, or a refinement and a better refinement to our lives. So mitzvot, therefore, according to this answer, we totally understand why they're everywhere, because it's got to touch every aspect, even the things that you would think are not religious, things that have nothing to do with holiness or with God. And God's like, no, even within that, do these. This is how you should act. This is how you bring meaning. This is how you infuse your life. And so, yes, how we parent, how we eat are going to be things that God is going to tell us how you can do it with a more meaningful way. So that is the first answer. The second answer, though, was God wants a relationship with us. And so if you look at that, I know you said you had the racy one. A relationship is about fulfilling whose desires. If I am in a relationship and I only think about myself, my relationship is lacking. My relationship should be about my wife. It should be about the us. It shouldn't be about fulfilling my pleasures. It should be about connecting, and connecting cannot only be in one aspect of our life. It cannot only be in the physical sense within the bedroom, but if you really want to connect with your spouse or your significant other, that relationship is way more than just the physical touch, and way more than just the excitement of the relationship. And so in this one, of course, there's an idea of having mitzvot in the spiritual sense and the ones that we would connect to spirituality, but those don't really touch the everyday life. And so it's like a relationship that's just in the bedroom, but nowhere else. And so if we want to connect with God, and here's the fascinating thing, how can you connect to God? God is infinite. But because God wants this relationship, God gave us the methods, the avenues of how to connect with God. But again, not just in the racy parts of life, but also in the everyday aspects of our life. And so for that reason, mitzvot, according to that text, was a divine connection. A real relationship is every part of your life. And then we came to the third one, which was the purpose of creation. And that one was God, why did God create this world to begin with? Does God need the world? Sorry, you're fine. Does God need this world? But God said, I want a home. I want a home which means I want to be expressed within everything in this world. And so if we're going to change the status quo and infuse it with godliness, making this world a place where you can find God everywhere, then mitzvot are the method to do that through action. Action is, if we talk about the ways that we express ourselves, we have thought, speech, and action. Action would be the lowest of the three. And so if we want to talk about God within the lowest parts of this world, it's got to be in the parts that we do action in. And so mitzvot are action-based, at least most of them. And that makes this world a conduit for the expression of God, which is what God wants in this world, a home. A home is where we feel comfortable, where we can just be ourselves. And so mitzvot, specifically those that are within the mundane acts of our life, are where we express God the most and where we show that this is God's home. So those are the three reasons why there are so many do's and don'ts in Judaism, because one, we're either, like we shared on the last one, we're either creating a home or we're connecting to God, and it has to be in everything. Or the third one, it's about refining ourselves, and who best would know than the author or the creator of how to do that. So those are the three reasons why we have so many mitzvot and why they pertain to every part of our life. Do we like it? Depends, right? But at least you have an understanding. When I do it, wow, I'm connecting. Wow, I am affecting God to have a home here. I'm bringing God into my life, into my home. And I'm also becoming a better person. So there are those benefits as well. I like to think of the mitzvot as when I share the answer, I typically connect to that middle one. And I say, hey, the idea of a mitzvah is that what an amazing opportunity that God is giving us a method to connect. And when I do that mitzvah, I'm connecting. An infinite God wants to connect to me. That's the idea that I kind of associate. But again, each person needs something that drives them. Yes.
So when you put the left shoe on first, that you're right shoe, is that, I assume that that's over and above the 600.
Correct.
So,
Correct.
So.
But when you do it, think about your presence of mind when you slip your shoe in, or you slip your foot in, and you're like, God cares about everything, even the way I get dressed. Yeah, if you did it wrong, you don't have to worry.
So really, it's on
613. But how many apply today? Is the
well,
question.
but you just said the right shoe and left shoe is over and above.
That's not a mitzvah.
Huh?
I wouldn't call it a mitzvah. It's part of the conduct of living a Jewish way of life.
Okay.
So it will fit into a parent's category. But again, it gives us presence of mind. And one of the things, I think it's a text, I don't know if it's in this week's, but it's a very standard Jewish text that says you should always know, I think it is in today's, know that God is always in front of you. Well, how do you do that? First of all, that sounds a little bit scary, but that depends on your relationship. So if my relationship with God is of fear, then I'm going to do things because I'm afraid of my punishment. But this answer was, it has nothing to do with the do nots or else. It has to do with come with me on this journey, either of refining yourself, of connecting with God, or making this world a home for God. So it's about our relationship. Two people could ask the same question and be coming from a different perspective on that. And one answer will talk to them or to one and not to the other. If I fear God, what type of a fear? If I'm fear of punishment, that's not the same relationship as love. We'll leave it at that. All right, here is I call this more of a levity question. Why do many Jews sway when they pray? Anyone want to throw an answer if you didn't read this yet? But do we notice this? You ever?
Oh, yeah.
Right? Why do we do that?
Bowing.
But I'm not bowing. This is like I'm not bowing, I'm swaying.
But there is also bowing.
Yeah, that's separate. Just look at a video of the kotel and people are praying. If you need a visual and you're like, or if you like, why? Okay, so the first answer, I always love this answer. You have a thought for this?
This one is, because years, hundreds of years ago, in all of Europe, they only had one standard, one Torah.
All right, that's what we're going to read it inside. We'll read this inside. All right, you're up.
And Steve, Chicago. It often happens that many persons read from the same book at the same time. It is possible that 10 or more read from one Bible to 5 books so large. Each of these readers was thus obliged to bend down in this turn in order to read the passage.
And by the way, I've been watching it happen right here. I mean, Andrea doesn't have a book, so Susie's, So again, the first answer is there is no significance to it. It was practical, and then we just got into the habit. Then we couldn't get it out. We couldn't shake it out. All right, but now to go on to like a more serious answer. Okay, here we go. We're gonna go to text number 11 for a more serious answer.
Diana. I'm from Buffalo and I lived here for 43. It is customary to swear while reading the Torah, as it says, Psalms 35:10. All of my limbs shall say, God, who is like you. We thereby testify that we with all of our sins are harmoniously praised.
So really, really an interesting message here. That number one is when we read the Torah or when we pray, don't forget about your physical body. That sounds very spiritual and very part of the mind. It's like, wait, include your body in praising God. It shouldn't just be a mental or soulful prayer. Get your body involved. The original like beach body prayers, get active. All right, but now we're going to go just a slightly, one of the things that we ended last week's class with was the idea of the yahrzeit candle, the memorial candle. We talked about the soul being likened to a candle, likened to a flame that's constantly striving and jumping. It wants to be encompassed in godliness, but it has a purpose here on earth. And so now the Zohar adds a deeper explanation to this, and we could read text number 12.
I'm Susan from Elyria, Ohio, to this late hearing, and I've been here since '84. Why is it that we sway to and fro when we study the Torah? A habit becomes naturally to us, and we are unable to keep still. It is written, soul of man is God's candle. When we utter even one word of Torah, the flame of the soul is kindled. We cannot keep still, but sway to and fro like the flame of the Lord.
So again, it's spiritual sense that you've really awakened the soul, and it's like a candle, it moves, it doesn't sit. And so it's really an expression of the soul. Now, I think it's important to mention, though, the most important thing in the end of the day is not whether we move, but rather that we are in the right mindset. So that is the reason why we sway when we pray.
Not because we're all ADHD.
Correct. Correct. Okay, so on that note, of this idea of tough questions, we're jumping right into number 6. Now, for some people, these aren't tough questions, by the way, but you're talking to me. Okay, so what I want to do is before we go into the actual answer, let's talk about the history. When did separate seating begin? And sorry, I shouldn't say when did it begin. When did mixed seating begin? Family seating. So that's what we'll read in text 13. Like this had nothing to do with gender equality. Let's put it that way. And maybe, in fact, actually, if you want to read on your own, I'll summarize it just to make sure we finish today's class on time. The introduction of family seating happened when the church had cultural shifts. And so they're the ones who, if you are familiar with this phrase, the family that prays together stays together. That had nothing to do with women and men being equal. It was a way to keep the seats warm in church, to have people show up. And so eventually they linked religious values to family values, but that's not how it began. And so again, you can read that. This is from Professor Jonathan Sarna, who has a lot to talk about the origins and Jewish history in that sense. But now that you have that knowledge, let's talk about the synagogue and where its place is really in Jewish life. So the synagogue was never a setting, really, if you think about throughout history, of family togetherness, which is what the mixed family seating of the church eventually brought about. Really, the home is the center of Jewish life, so much so that Jewish law says if you have enough money to build a mikveh or a synagogue, build a mikveh, because the mikveh centers on the home, family life, husband and wife. And interestingly, not every family uses a mikveh, and we still say put the money there rather than in a synagogue. So what was the center of Jewish life in Jewish tradition? The home. You did a Shabbat dinner at home, not at synagogue. You keep kosher at home. Parents teach their children at home. You teach your children about charity at home. There's a mezuzah on the door. You teach them about blessings. The home is the center of Jewish life. However, other religions the church or the house of worship was the focus or the heartbeat of their religion. Judaism said, no, home. Home is where you're going to live it. Home is where you're going to teach it. And if you do it at home, that's where it can thrive. And that's where it can continue. So this idea of the home being so important is really expressed in the story of Jacob and the stones. So Jacob leaves his home for the first time in his life. His first night away from home, he puts 12 stones around him, puts his head underneath the stone, and he says, this stone becomes the cornerstone of the future temple. Right? It was a stone from the Jewish home, from his home. This was his new home. He had one night. The goal of the temple and of the synagogue is not to limit religious experience to those places, but rather to infuse the home with holiness, which is kind of what we talked about. Where do you want to bring God into? The most mundane parts. You want it in your home. You want God in your home. And so here we read text number 14.
I'm Suzanne. Originally from the Bronx, and I'm here 41 years. This is the mistake so often made by civilizations that pride themselves in building beautiful cathedrals and houses of God. They build, as the prophet Ezekiel 43:8 puts it, their doorsteps next to my doorstep. They visit God in his house, but forbid his entry into theirs, where his presence with his thoughts might certainly be inconvenient. That was not the thought with which the first foundation stone was laid for the first house of God. The sanctity of the home is the necessary condition for the sanctity of the house of God. The house of God is sanctified not because it is the place to which holiness is relegated, but because from there, holiness is to flow out and penetrate the entire human sphere.
So the home is the Jewish nerve center. By the way, this is not the end of the answer, of course. The home is the Jewish nerve center. And if that's the case, you don't need family seating in the synagogue. Your whole idea of life is the family. So then, according to this, for those who don't do Judaism at home, or don't necessarily, I don't want to say don't do Judaism at home, but maybe it's not their focus. For them, it was important. How do I do ritual with my family? How do I bring my family together in this? Well, then the synagogue, we got to sit together. So it kind of brings about the other idea of that. But according to this idea, the machitza might remind us exactly that. It's like, wait, when your family, nucleus, Judaism, nerve center of your life, oh, that's at home. Here we're separate. But on that note, I do want to share something quite fascinating to me that I quote quite often. As I was studying this text, there's a footnote that they gave to share that I always found like mind-blowing. Early 1900s, Germany, reform seat of the reform movement. A man went to one of the churches, offered 1 million marks. I just want to make sure the number is correct. Give me a second. Yeah, 1 million marks. He would donate it to the reform congregation. One condition: remove the machitza. Okay? Remove the machitza. So this is early 1900s reform congregation, Hamburg, Germany. And they refused. That's where the crazy. So one shock that they had a machitza. Second shock that they said, no, thank you. So where did it change? Eventually they come to America, and that's where you start seeing the machitza actually leave even the reform movement. But here's the thing. This tells us why Judaism doesn't focus on the family unit in the shul, in the congregational setting. But it still didn't answer why we can't just remove the machitza and just pray together. We only talked about why we don't need it. We didn't need to remove it because the family was already having that at home. But maybe they're onto something. Maybe Judaism should have family-style seating in the congregational setting. And so, to appreciate the reason for separate seating, let's talk about what prayer is. So that's text number 15.
When you pray, know before him to stay.
So when we
Oh.
pray, you do win. So when we pray, we're in the presence of God. That's what prayer is. Prayer is saying, hey, right now I'm connecting to God. I'm in the moment. And if you think about it, knowing this, there's a real deep connection. And in the Hebrew word for da, know, is the same word that's used that Adam knew Eve. Or we use that word to talk about like a real deep, intimate connection. And so when you are praying, prayer is a deep connection with God. Now, with that knowledge, let's talk about the idea of prayer as connection. We call it in Hebrew as well, avodah shebalev, which means the service of the heart. Prayer is an idea of attachment to God. In fact, the Hebrew word tefillah actually translates better to connect than to prayer, because prayer is asking for needs. The Hebrew word for that would be bakasha, but tefillah is to connect. And so because it's about connection, it's about the mindset. We use the kavanah, the thoughts, to get us into that goal, into that mindset, emotionally involved in that prayer, mentally involved in that prayer. And so because of that, because of this connection to God during prayer, by the way, if our prayer is lacking, we have what to work on. That's what I say about my prayer, right? I might not feel that, but this is the goal. The goal is that in the moment of prayer, you feel that deep connection. And so the function of the synagogue, the function of the sanctuary is to facilitate that connection, right? When you go to some of the hospitals and they now have like, they have rooms where you can meditate, they build them accordingly, lighting, sound. The synagogue has the same rules in Jewish law. And so I want to go through some of those laws, and you can look at it on page 69. I'll use the screen. How should you set up a prayer? These are things that you find in Code of Jewish law. Number one is, if you have artwork, it shouldn't be at eye level because that's distracting. And you'll start thinking about that instead of thinking about God. Windows, for the same reason, should be above eye level. You don't want to see what's going on the streets. During prayer, look down, because if you look up, you're distracted by people. Oh, that's a nice Gucci handbag. That's well, you know, the things that we start looking at. Don't pray facing a mirror. And really, prayer, you should come in with before eating. The first thing you should do is pray to God. But if hunger is going to distract you, eat something before that. And so, by the way, we're talking about the morning prayers. Obviously, if you're praying in the afternoon, you ate. So the idea of the mechitza is really about helping us to not be distracted. Now, this isn't, I don't think I'm sharing anything new here, but if it's new to you that men look at women and find something that might be of a distracting sense, and it does work the other way, but I'd say men have a bigger problem with that. The mechitza is not saying women are bad and men are good. It's saying that this is part of the setting of the synagogue, is to not be distracted. So it's not, a mechitza is not there to remove men from women, but to put both of them in front of God, that they both of us don't have a distraction. And so this is the idea of the mechitza. It's not to separate men from women, but to separate both of them unto God. So when you have that context, you understand this is not about anything more than what am I supposed to be doing when I pray? Now, the fact is, in the end of the day, you can still go to shoals that aren't comfortable, right? The fact is, in a perfect world, this mechitza makes sense, but we live in the 21st century, and there are almost every single thing we do in life is not separate. And so this runs counter to everything that we do on a daily, in our daily life. Number two, and this will come up in another class, women don't lead prayer. So if you just thought the mechitza was a good thing in a traditional synagogue, you're like, wait a second, this and that, sell that to someone else. And so we'll talk about that next. It makes the mechitza even more awkward. And again, next week, that's going to talk about that. Number three, a lot of times, and this is something that bothers me, you go to a synagogue and the women's section, because now there's a mechitza, is like in the back. And you feel like you're in the closet. You don't feel involved. You don't feel at least side by side. And so that should be something that we talk about and try to make it better and enhance it. Definitely there's a lot to work on for that. But again, that doesn't mean that the answer is to remove it. It might mean to make it more inclusive and more welcoming. Any questions? I know that's a heavy one. Yes, go for it.
Yeah. Women part of their Shabbat services.
Okay, you have a,
Historically, when did, in traditional Judaism, not the more conservative, when did women start? Because women weren't usually. allowed
right.
to
You have a very good question. Like if we talk about, by the way, Dr. Sarna talks a lot about this. Like that's that's part of his field. The question is, first of all, I share this. I'm going to use a slightly different example to this. If you go to a Reformed congregation, Friday night is very full. Lots of women, children, everybody. If you go to a traditional synagogue, Friday night's like empty of women, but Saturday can be very full. Why is that? Friday night's about Shabbat dinner. That's at home. And so what we're going to come to answer your question is really the question about prayer. Like our woman and prayer, which is going to be part of that conversation next week. So I don't have an answer like when did the synagogue become more and more infused, but you are correct that there's an automatic kind of like a rebound. So someone's, let's say, going to one congregation and they're growing in their Judaism and they want to be involved, but the next one doesn't have as much involvement of women. And it's like, okay, so they start adjusting. So there's definitely some truth to that. But there was, and I don't know, to answer your question about the shtetl, if they had women's sections. Yeah, I don't know the answer. So it is a good question.
Traditional.
It is a good question, but it's definitely a more modern question, meaning you didn't see that years ago.
Right.
You had a question?
No, it's just a little confused. I was raised conservative. And of course, there was never any separation, but where does it say it should be? And are the conservative followers doing something wrong?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was saying,
Oh, no, very good question. Actually, in the temple, there was something called the women's courtyard. It's talked about in some of like, when you talk about, they talked about like the pilgrimages and the dancing on, during Sukkot. It talks about the women's courtyard, that they would watch and observe the men dancing. So it comes out in different ways. It's not like, hey, put up a divider. It's more like, how did you foster the intermingling and the separation at the same time? So in certain settings you had it, in certain settings it was clear separation, but it's a very good question. Like there isn't a text you say, hey, this is the text. But when you talk about tradition, tradition is like, okay, that's far back.
No, and I think it's important. I mean, I remember as a little girl going with my grandmother to shul and I'm like, why do we have to be behind the curtain? They need to be out there. And she never had an answer. I felt that. That's
Right,
what-
she just accepted it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's like what we talked about.
Yeah, so it made me not want to do that.
Right. No, these are the good point. Like I do know that that's very important. Like when questions come up now, especially if you don't know the answer, instead of just saying that's what we do, it's like, you know, I don't know, but I'm gonna research it and actually look. Yeah, that's a very important part. Yes.
Not only in synagogue, things are separated, like if you go to a wedding,
Dancing.
you can't dance, or.
Correct. But that again comes back to. Right, that comes back to the intermingling of sexes. Does it cause or can it cause issues that lead to the bedroom? That's kind of like the joke. There is a joke about this, you know, like why when the rabbi speaks, you can't sleep because that could lead to dancing. Men and women sleeping, it could lead, there's a whole long joke about that. But yes, the idea is like we have to understand, first of all, okay, what's the issue that we're trying to circumvent or protect from, I think is important. Like if you talk to me about handshakes, I don't think it comes up in any of these classes. Like touch is very powerful. Well, where's the line? Is it the hug, the kiss, the handshake? Everyone has a line. I was like, you're now in my personal space. But what are we trying to protect? That you don't come into my personal space, or that we understand that there really is an attraction between men and women. Marriage is sacred. I can point to a Jewish text for that, but when you listen to a vice president say, hey, I don't do dinner without my wife with somebody of the opposite gender, he's doing it because of his religious values and not to put himself in a situation that could lead to something or an accusation. We can either say he's crazy Or we could say, I respect that he has a special connection with his wife and doesn't want to ever be challenged. I'm not going into that. I'm saying like Judaism at least has rules for it. We do have a short time, so I want to always make sure I finish the original questions on time and then extras after, or other additional questions. This is a very good question. Why is Israel important to the Jews? It is an important question for many reasons. And many of the answers that people are going to share, if I would ask you this question, it's like, well, we need a homeland. We need a place where we feel safe. It's the answer to anti-Semitism. But if that was the purpose, and if that was Israel's purpose, just for anti-Semitism, we have a number of problems. Number one is, why does it have to be Israel? It could be any land. And if we remember the Jewish history, Theodore Herzl was looking at Uganda. What happens if I don't need refuge? I feel pretty safe here. I don't need Israel, right? Maybe for a couple more years. And then it's also saying that there's really nothing positive about Israel. It's just that society, we just need it because of violence and hatred. And lastly, Israel has no religious significance then. It's just about protecting us from anti-Semitism. And so really Israel is important because that's where our history lies. Our patriarchs lived there. Our holy temple stood there. God promised this land to us. Some mitzvot can only be done in Israel. These are on the screen. And it is a place where the divine is more present and accessible. But in the end of the day, why did God promise us this land? Why did he say mitzvot have to be done only in this geographical location? Why did he say this land is holier than other lands? And so that's what we want to know. So if we'll look at text 16. This is the very first commentary on the Torah, on the first verse from Rashi. So text 16, page 71.
Hi, I'm Susie originally from Chicago. I've been here about 23 years. It would have been more appropriate to begin the Torah with the words, "This month is to be for you," first month, Exodus 12:2, which is the first commandment given to the Jews, namely to establish the Jewish calendar. Why does the Torah start with, "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth"? So that if the nations of the world should say to Israel, "You are robbers, for you conquered by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan," Israel will reply, "The entire earth belongs to God. He created it, as we learned from the story of creation, and gave it to whomever he deemed proper. He gave it to them, and when he wished, he took it away from them and gave it to us."
So Rashi's commentary he raises 2 questions. Almost every nation that came into existence, including the Canaanites, took its land from somebody before them. And so this would be, why would any nation have a complaint against the Jewish people if they end up in the land? I mean, they all have their own skeletons in their closets. And number 2, why would God change the entire Torah to start with this verse instead of starting from the book of Shemot, which we just started? And so he answers that clearly there must be a spiritual and religious claim to the land of Israel, that the nations and even the Jews might share why we don't need the land of Israel. What is it? The claim was that Jews don't need land to be a nation. I could be a Jew anywhere. Look, we're in America and we're Jews. So he answered, no, our mission is to create this world in a way, not to create, but to make this world that it reflects the Jewish values that God shared through the Torah. And so because of that, this is why we need this land. This is why the land of Israel is so important, because this is where we can do that. And on that note, when we do that, you need a land to express that. And so I'll read text 17. The mission and purpose of the Jewish people is to turn the lowest reality into a home for God, meaning that God should be expressed through materiality of this physical world. This is why most mitzvot are action-based, so that sanctity will be expressed in the physical realm as well. For this reason, the land of Israel was given to the Jewish people, a physical land where many of the mitzvot find their only expression, because the purpose of the Jewish people in the Torah is to conquer the materiality of this world and turn it into a home for God. So our mission needs our own land. If we were to show how this exists, we need to do it in our own land. Now, obviously, to build a society on Torah ideals does not look the way any country looks today. It doesn't look the way Israel looks today. But in order to do that, we need a land to do that. And so,
Can I ask a very quick question?
sure.
How does that change when, I mean, you've got three common laws, the first temple, second temple, and the current Medinat Yisrael? How does that change when the first two were founded by religious foreign Jews, and the current state, which we all support, was founded by secular?
Right. So very good question. The short answer is that the first two were great opportunities, but they clearly didn't last, right? Whether it was because we made mistakes and we did make mistakes. We were exiled from the land. The current state of Israel doesn't follow no one calls it a Torah law state. In the olden day, though, first temple, second temple, it followed the laws of the Torah. There were Jewish courts that could enforce laws, capital punishment included. So the point is that today we don't have that. That's a fact. But when the state of Israel would be this type of land where we can express that, again, that's tax law, that's healthcare, that's everything that we talk about today in politics, defense, the legal code, social programs, education. When it follows the Torah's ideals, that you need the land of Israel for. But that doesn't answer why this land, that's why Israel is important, but why this land? As they say, like, couldn't you give us a different land? So I'm not going to read 18 inside because of time, but I actually think it's a very worthy read. He shares that Israel is a centrally located piece of land that all trade roads pass through. Now, obviously, today we have the Suez Canal, so it doesn't work like that. And therefore, Jews benefited from people who would travel through, learned the best of their lands and ideas, but we also shared everything godly and everything that the Torah taught to them, so that hopefully they would take what we could share and change their lands and their lives. Now, there is one deeper explanation, though. In the end of the day, that's an idea that Rabbi Kaplan, who recently passed away, shares. In the end of the day, though, the land of Israel, this is text 19, is cherished because God chose it. And so maybe that's why everyone wants this land. It's God's chosen land. Right? In the end of the day, Israel is special because God chose it. And you can't ask questions on choice, right? A true choice is not when you have one thing better than the other. Because then it's not, I'm choosing something because that tastes better or that looks better. Choice is when you have two equal things and you just do it. And so God chose this land. That's what makes it so special. Yes.
Just a simple question here. It says a physical land where many of the mitzvah find their only expression. Can you give me an example?
Yeah, the laws of seventh year, Shemitah, sabbatical year. So the lands are fallow for a year. Any person can take anything on that land. That's exclusively to Israel. That's one of them. Okay. And there are more, some of the tithings, but that's a good example.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good question. So did you guys hear that? It's like, what's an example of a mitzvah that's exclusive to the land of Israel? There are many more that are specific to the temple, which could only be in Jerusalem. So you have, but that's one that like affects, it does still happen today. 2022, I think, was a sabbatical year. Yeah, it makes for an interesting visit to Israel. Okay, and then for the last question, and we'll run through this one quickly. I'm sorry about the time. Why does the Bible call for animal sacrifices? Now, this is a question that obviously for us, it's like, we're so far removed from sacrifices that the question, it's like, who sacrifices animals or anything these days? So our question, obviously, it's not offered anymore. Let's put it that way. You need a temple. Maybe it's wasteful. How does it benefit God? Like, these are the questions. So number one thing that I want to share is animals that were offered as sacrifices were eaten. So they were slaughtered, and only a part of it went onto the altar. So it wasn't really wasteful, but in the end of the day, like, it seems primitive. I mean, how does God benefit from an animal that's on the altar? That's the question that we're addressing. And so there are a couple aspects and explanations to this. The first one is that it's important to know that the Torah does respect animal life. There are laws about treating animals properly. But with that, the first answer that he shares is God blessed Adam and Eve, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea, over the fowl of the sky, and over all the beasts that tread upon the earth. So the first thing is that God tells human beings, that's why we're reading this text, that you're allowed to have benefit from these animals, bring them into your service of God. So that's an important pretext. The result of that, though, is really more radical than a principled vegetarian. Look at text 21. If the entire world is meant to be used for godliness, and you don't, while walking in the street, one must think words of Torah. But when someone goes about not occupied with Torah, the stone he treads upon exclaims, Bulach, clod, how dare you trample me? How are you higher than I am? So in other words, God creates the world, human beings are at the top. We have the ability to elevate those things that are beneath us. But when you don't, even the simple cement will call out and say, hey, dude, you don't have any right to be on me if you don't act as the superior in the sense of that. But again, we don't have, the idea is that we benefit from things that are tied to our divine mission. So one answer to this idea of animal sacrifice is that it's a concession. And again, this is in text 22a. I'm going to, because of time, I'm going to share it outside. I encourage you to read it. Is one of the answers that you find a lot in certain Jewish mitzvot is that we became Jewish and therefore we had baggage. And so there was always animal sacrifice. If God would say, you're the Jewish people, I don't need animal sacrifice, don't do it anymore. For us, the idea of religion and worship as a people that came from idolatry was like, wait, no, I need to do a sacrifice. And so the first thing that Maimonides says is that maybe that's why. Maybe the reason why sacrifices was given to the Jewish people is because you can't change somebody by saying, hey, full 180, it's just not going to work. We won't take on this religion. So that's his first answer. It is a highly controversial answer. The interesting thing is he writes that in one of his books or one of his works. He does not write that in his book of law. So in his Guide to the Perplexed, he uses this answer. But in another place he writes, and this is text 22b, Mishpatim are the mitzvot whose rationales are openly revealed and whose benefits are known. For example, prohibition of robbery, bloodshed, obligation to honor one's parents. Chukim, which we talked about in the first text on the first class, are the mitzvot whose rationales are not known. And our selfish inclinations pester us about these laws. And the nations of the world challenge them. Examples, look at the examples that he says. Prohibition to eat pig or milk mixed with meat. And then he says all of the sacrifices are in this category. No reason other than God said so. So what do? We still want to try to understand it, right? Because that's the theme of this. So one answer for sacrifices is that when you offer an animal as a sacrifice, it could have been you. Like you have to put yourself in the mindset that I need to be better. And the fact is that in life, actions bring about emotions. And so sacrifice tells us or impresses upon a person the severity of sin. I'm bringing this sacrifice because I've sinned. Really, that should have been me, separated from God. So in the moments of sin, we're like an animal. We chose something, we're disengaged from mind. We act more animalistic, following our pleasures. And so sacrifice reminds us of this. So the second idea, though, is a korban means to be close. It comes from the Hebrew word karov. And so through it, we become closer to God because we work on ourselves. We put that mindset and we now connect to God in a better way, in a more meaningful way. And so sometimes you need to do something quite drastic, like a sacrifice, to make this emotional impression to help us in our repentance. The second thing is that there is a text, this is text 24, that says, anytime they offered a sacrifice, it elevated all animals not just the animal that you put on the altar. Just like charity, this was, you gave away a part of your income, but it elevates the rest of your money. And so too with the sacrifices. So again, those are we elevate the physical animals by offering the sacrifices that were given to God. Now, interestingly, of course, today we don't have sacrifices. So obviously, God doesn't want them from us. That's the law. So how do we come to this? How do we become closer? So maybe it says that when we offer our prayers, they're in place of sacrifices. That's our prayers. We talk about the sacrifices, and it should put us into that mindset. So again, according to his answer, change is difficult. And so that was the first answer of Maimonides, and therefore we had to share some of the things that you had from your previous religion. And then the second one is, no, the truth is sacrifices have no explanation, God said. And then we tried giving an answer, purposes, discourage transgression, reminds us of that need to get rid of the material. Like it's important to be spiritual and mindset on God. And those are the ideas to elevate animal life. I'm going to end here because that's time already, past time. But if you do want to hear some of the other answers very briefly from class 5, I can do that. And again, I am finished with the class, so I don't want you to think you have to stay here. You're not offending me. It's more like for those of you who want to get some of those last questions in. Sure.
Like my mom, and then
There's 2 rabbis, Maimonides and Nachmanides. I don't know why, because the Hebrew is Rambam and Ramban. So I don't know.
just noticed that.
Yeah, I don't know the answer.
My
My pleasure. Have a good night. All right, anyone want to hear those other answers quickly? You do. Okay. This is from class 5. And again, don't worry if you're leaving. I'm going to go quickly through these. Why is a God-fearing person? Oh, wait a minute. But why is a God-fearing person praiseworthy? Isn't fear a negative emotion? Again, this is only if you'd like to stay for some of these answers. Why is a God-fearing person praiseworthy? Isn't fear a negative emotion? Shouldn't love be enough? And so again, I'm not using the screen for these. Number 1 is fear could have positive outcomes. There are positive fears, for example, afraid of touching heat. Right, so fear can be a positive thing that helps rather than hinders. Number 2 is fear of punishment, even though this is not ideal, but a fear of punishment keeps people on the straight and narrow. Love alone is never enough in a relationship. You have to have honor, respect. Fear would fall into that category. And then we talk about a higher fear in Judaism. It's called awe. There's yira tata, which means the lower fear. And then there's yira ilah, which is the greater fear, that you're so in awe of God. That here's a God that cares about me. Here's this infinite entity that cares about my actions. So this is the idea of where fear can be a positive thing. This was one of the tough questions. Why does matrilineal descent? Why does God and Jewish law recognize matrilineal descent? Okay, so number 1 is to be a Jew, and to be born a Jew means that you were born with a specific set of God-given responsibilities. The only way to know what type of mission God has given to you is to look at the Torah. How else do I, right? Some people are not Jewish. They have a different mission. So to be born a Jew means you were given a specific set. Now, how do I know then who is a Jew? If I need to know what my mission in life is, how do I know if I was born with that set or not? And so practically the Torah tells us if your mother was Jewish, the child is Jewish, they have that set. If the mother wasn't Jewish and the father was Jewish, because there's going to be marriages that have interfaith marriages throughout our history. So how do I know what I am if I'm one of those unions? So the answer is God had to tell us. This one is, this one isn't. This one has this purpose, this one doesn't. Now, the thing is, though, why the mother, not the father?
Mitochondria best off with no.
Is that why? So biologically, we always know that the mother has more influence on the child, right? The mother carries the child for 9 months. That's during the creation of the child. Educationally, the mother has more influence. Think about who spends more time with their children, the father or the mother. Now that can change in some families, but as traditionally, this would be a truth. And lastly, matrilineal lineage is definite, especially in the olden day. Now we have DNA. You always knew who the mom was,
That's what.
who the dad was.
Right.
Now we have ways to do that, but again, this is throughout our history. And by the way, think about it. Even though we have DNA checking, I mean, that's off limits to many people. Now, why do some Jews wear old-fashioned clothes? So there is,
What is considered old fashioned?
well, I think when people ask this question, it's like black hat, longer coat.
Oh.
Well, I think they're asking
Yeah.
about like the
Covering
Hasidic
up.
groups.
Yeah,
So the thing is, there is a Jewish law that talks about how a Jew has to look. Like you have to look different than the non-Jews. Question is, what does that mean? Does that mean I don't follow their new customs? Like, oh, the newest shoe is out, do that, or does it mean in a more defined way? And so throughout Eastern Europe, we're talking about historically, the Jews wore a distinctive dress. At a certain point, the Tsar said, you cannot dress like that. And so those communities that defied the Tsar in the mid-19th century, they stayed most loyal to those distinctive styles of dress. There is a teaching, and I should look back at that over there, that says that when our ancestors have fought to the death or have been persecuted to the death for a mitzvah, we care about those mitzvahs more, meaning generations later. One of the examples that they talk about that we don't care about as much, because we were never really persecuted, and I'm going to find this because I thought it was interesting, was tefillin. But one of the ones that we did fight for, here, let me find it.
but you're saying we did not fight for tefillin?
Yeah, meaning people didn't die for tefillin.
Mm-hmm.
So here are the examples. This is from the Talmud. Any commandment for which our ancestors accepted martyrdom in face of oppressive regimes, that mitzvah is firmly adhered to generations later. Examples include refusing idolatry and performing circumcision. Like people, even today, like that's an important thing for Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Any commandment for which our ancestors did not accept martyrdom in face of oppressive regimes, that mitzvah is feebly adhered to generations later. An example is the mitzvah of tefillin. So the same thing is here. The Jewish communities that really fought the Tsar and put in prison, killed because they wanted to dress differently, because they were following that opinion. That said, you have to dress very different, not, just don't follow the latest trend. Those communities till today really care about that. So their dress is because of, but why did they dress differently? At least it has some sort of a basis in Jewish law that according to some opinions, when it says to be different than the non-Jews or than the Gentiles, it also meant in dress. So I don't think I fit that bill right now. But if I was wearing, let's say, the beaver hat or what we call the strimal, that would be a great example. Yeah.
On a Friday night in Jerusalem, you see men wearing all different types of
Correct,
clothes,
of
all
course.
different types of hats.
Different
Is
Hasidic
that-
groups.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, that was.
So that's one of the questions, because my sister is, and
So,
all my nephews.
right. By the way, I will tell you, I have no knowledge of the differences, but there are people who can say, oh, I see those socks. Okay, he's Vishnitz. And I
Right.
see he's wearing black socks, but they're tucked into the pants, or the pants are tucked in. Oh, he's Bubba. I'm using that. Or you look at the type of jacket. Yeah, I don't know it, but that's.
You go, why do you go, when you go there, I mean, go to New York, go to Israel. I can go there and I can tell in the neighborhood that the buttons are on the right side or they're on the left side of why they're wearing these socks and
Right.
how high their triangles are.
I don't know. There isn't an explanation
There is
to
no
that, but those
explanation.
communities had it and have sustained it. Next question. Why would the Torah state, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk? That's the prohibition of eating milk and meat. That's how it's written. Kid means a goat, by the way. All right, that's what they cook kid. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Right? If the intention and prohibition, according to the Talmud, meaning the oral tradition, is way broader. And I just want to share what does it mean it's way broader. It says you cannot cook it, you cannot eat it, and you can't have any benefit from it. There are 3 prohibitions just right there. And the verse just says, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Why didn't they just say it straight out? Don't eat it. Don't. And here it's a kid in its mother's milk. The law applies to way more than that. So the reason is that there are a number of laws that we learn from it. From each word of that verse, we learn multiple things. If they would have just said it straight out. For example, by the way, that if it's a wild animal, this prohibition did not exist. So if you had deer or venison with milk, this was not a prohibition for that. Now, the rabbinic prohibition is because we don't want people to mix up, but I'm talking about from the Bible. So because of that, there were so many laws that were learnt from this. Now, in Judaism, there are derived laws that come from the oral tradition. And so there were way more laws that were included in this simple verse. If they would have just said it straight out, we wouldn't be able to learn those things. That's kind of the short answer to that. And I actually will share, if you want to, if you're a little bit later, you can look on page 225. These are all of the things that were derived from those words. Forbidden to eat milk and meat together, but it only pertains if they were cooked together in the Bible. Remember, the rabbinic law adds a lot more prohibitions, but only if they were cooked. If you just put milk in the pot and put your meat in there and, you know, kind of like dunking cookies, that would be fine. It doesn't apply to meat from non-kosher. It doesn't apply to meat from wild kosher animals, like I said, deer. It doesn't apply to birds, and we do apply it to birds today, right? But again, biblically, it doesn't. The prohibition applies to the animal fat, not just its meat. Good to know, right? Prohibition pertains to a kosher animal that died even without proper slaughter. The prohibition does not apply to male lactation, which apparently was common enough in male goats. I'm not a farmer, but like maybe that's fine to mix in. The answer is yes. And then lastly, it doesn't apply to milk extracted after the animal dies, like from the udder. So because of that, there were so many more things that you learned from it that just putting it in the verse, we would have to have, the verse would be so long if we wanted to get every single thing out. So that's this word. Last question that we'll talk today is, why are eggs pareve? So in kosher laws, you can have milk with an egg, you can have meat with an egg, but the egg came from the animal. So shouldn't it be meat? So the answer is, the entire reason that we don't do a bird with milk is rabbinic. They said, hey, people might confuse it with meat. Meat is prohibited. And so they said the bird cannot either be eaten with milk. However, they did not pass that worry. They weren't worried that people would make the same mistake with the egg itself and associate it as meat. And so because of that, they didn't extend the decree to the egg itself.
Now we can, what?
No, you can't. We don't eat chicken with milk. So chicken biblically is allowed, rabbinically is not. So meaning today in a kosher home, you wouldn't have milk with your chicken.
So which takes precedence? Rabbinic or?
Well, rabbinic never is less than. It's always more. That's why people don't like rabbinic law. It's always more. It's like, why do you have to make us more? That's the questions that always come up. I don't have a problem with rabbinic law. That's not what I mean. But any person says, why do the rabbis have to keep adding stuff? Is it like they're trying to make us